Thank you all very much for inviting me to be on campus today. Thank you, students, for bothering to read a book of poetry. Not everybody is interested in reading a book of poetry, so it's wonderful to see people who have an interest, and even if it was uneasy for you or like kind of an unfamiliar experience, maybe that's part of what we're doing at a college, is trying new things and broadening our experience. Let me give you just a little bit of background about this book, A Companion for Owls. I began writing the book in January or so, December or January of 1999, and spent the next 4 years or so completely immersed in writing the book, which was a thrill. It was the most intense and exciting creative thing I've ever done before or since. And the thrill was building a world that is partly historical and factual, and then another half of that world that's completely imagined, and finding a way to put the two together so that the whole is somewhat plausible or believable. And I'd find something over here in the factual, historical world that made a nice connection to something that was going on over here in the imagined world, and I'd find a poem that was a way to tie those two pieces together. One of the reasons why Daniel Boone interested me as an American who was significant in the history of the settling of Kentucky, that goes back to my childhood, wandering around in the woods. I read children's biographies of Daniel Boone, all the pioneers, Simon Kenton, also associated with Kentucky history. I don't know where all that came from. It was just in my little 7 or 8 year old brain to be interested in this stuff. But also I spent a lot of time outside as a kid. This is before internet and computers everywhere. And going outside was about the greatest thing you could possibly do when I was a child. And I loved trees, the woods, streams, rocks, critters. And so finding a figure like Daniel Boone in children's biographies, who was also interested in the woods and the wilderness, he was a childhood hero. And then as I got older and kind of more thoughtful about things, I realized that in terms of a broader spectrum of American history, Daniel Boone is one model of an American identity that we have held on to, and that is the model of the rugged individual, the independent person, the can-do, take care of it myself kind of American identity. And I happen to be sympathetic to that identity. Another kind of competing American identity is the identity that was kind of scripted for this country by Thomas Jefferson, who, as you know, wrote the Declaration of Independence, was very involved in writing the Constitution and other founding documents. Jefferson, as we all know, however, was a plantation owner, slave owner, aristocratic fellow. He was an admirable person in many ways, but in my view, Jefferson designed this country implicitly as a top-down paradigm. Boone comes from a bottom-up paradigm, grassroots, we now say. And those models are at play in our country even today. You don't have to look very far to see these models kind of clashing with each other. I don't know what we can do about that, but I'm not in a position to solve those problems. I just write poems. And I've tried to, although Daniel Boone did not spend a great deal of time in this part of the state, he was all over Kentucky. And he could have easily passed through this part of the state around 1800 when he left Kentucky and wound up going to Missouri, where he spent the remainder of his life. Part of the imaginative pleasure that I have had in working on this book, and it continues to be a pleasure, is imagining that Daniel Boone was one of the first people of European descent to see Kentucky with nothing in it except the land, the trees, the hills, the rivers, the animals, the birds. No human presence at all. A pristine kind of Garden of Eden experience of this state. And in fact, in Boone's lifetime, when there was a financial and a political interest in settling Kentucky and establishing statehood, sort of the ads for moving to Kentucky described Kentucky as the new Eden. So the first poem I'll read imagines Boone's first entry into Kentucky, which would have been probably 1767. First, arriving, we walked down as if we were hill-born and bred to know only hills, so that the end of hills was surprising, rolling out before us like a woman's skirts gathered and fanned across her lap, like loosely folded fabric, like calico, spotted and patchworked as if some big-fingered God had gently smudged the world he made. Our horses and our dogs paused. We had not expected glory, and it stopped us dead, which is not altogether uncommon. Moses, spying Canaan, for example, must have first stood silent before waving his people ahead, the land smothered in half shadow, half light, like velvet, and steadied himself, one hand firm on his staff, the other reaching to his brow, wiping his gray hair back. So I walked into Kentucky, barefooted and clumsy, as if I had sneaked out of school to cheat my lessons and come upon a girl waiting for me behind a beech tree, wondering where on earth I'd been. I stood still on the invisible line and spit across it onto the new map, making my first mark, wondering if I could keep such a dark and bloody secret to myself. Here in the last line, Kentucky, some people believe is a Shawnee name for the dark and bloody ground. Do we have some people in here who are familiar with the Bible? I remember an old song, the Bible, yes, that's the book for me. We can be pretty confident that Daniel Boone would have known some Bible verses and would have certainly understood biblical imagery and biblical metaphor. The next poem I'm going to read is called Without a Vision. And it has an epigraph. I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains. That's an Old Testament verse from 1 Kings. It so happens that the last battle of the American Revolution was fought where else but Kentucky. It was the Battle of Blue Licks, fought in August of 1782. And Boone was involved in the battle. It was a battle that the colonists, as they were known, or the settlers, rather, lost. The British won the final battle of the Revolutionary War, which is a great irony of American history. And Boone and his son Israel were involved in the battle, and Israel was killed. Without a vision. Don't ever name a son Israel. And don't ever follow a man hot for blood into battle, because he will bring blood upon you. That is the one wage of vengeance. If a man named McGarry declares you yellow, pretend you're deaf. Don't ride behind him to a place called the Blue Licks. That way, if you do have a son named Israel, you will never have to watch him fall and find him 5 days later, buzzards maddened at his throat, their wings tipped with his blood, his body torn in sundry pieces like a wandering nation, dispersed. You cannot bury such a vision. Israel keeps returning to me in wavering remnants, which is troubling because I come from a generation which knows very little about irony. And now history will look back and wonder what on earth I was thinking, whatever led me to follow. Sometimes it is a high price we pay for blinking. You question that a nation could depend on one man, and then in a moment you realize it does. The title of the book, A Companion for Owls, is a title that I got from reading a so-called autobiography of Daniel Boone that an itinerant high school teacher from Delaware conducted with Daniel Boone in about 1784. This man's name was John Filson, and he came to Kentucky as a settler. He had managed to buy some land in Kentucky that he wanted to chop into smaller pieces and resell to settlers. So he was a bit of a schemer, this John Filson, and he kind of recognized that if he could get an interview with Daniel Boone, who was by this time sort of a living legend, it might help his cause to sell parcels of Kentucky land. And so he conducted an interview with Boone that he published in a book in 1784. And this little section of his book he called The Autobiography of Colonel Boone. And in that autobiography, Boone says of himself, of his years wandering alone in Kentucky, that he was made a companion for owls. So I got the title for the book directly from Boone. However, that is actually a Bible verse from the book of Job, chapter 30, verse 29. And in the story of Job, he says, I am a brother to dragons and a companion to owls. So in the Boone quote, he says companion for owls. He gets a little word wrong in the quote from the Bible. But interestingly enough, some of you may know a Western Kentucky writer named Robert Penn Warren. Anybody familiar with him? He wrote the novel All the King's Men. It was his bestseller, I guess you could say. But he also published a book of poetry in the 1950s called Brother to Dragons. And that is, interestingly enough, about Thomas Jefferson's sister and her husband who moved to Western Kentucky, downriver from where we are now, and set up a plantation. And during those early years, this would be about 1810, the sons of this couple they were apparently wild. They got drunk one night and they brutally murdered a slave on the plantation. And were going to go to trial, likely to be hung. And so they made a pact with each other that they would shoot each other to avoid being hanged. And the story is one of them shot the other one, and the other one, in firing at the other brother, missed. So one of them died, and the other one ran off, and nobody ever heard from him again. The night of the murder, though, was the same night as the New Madrid earthquake in 1811. Everybody know about that? Yeah? It rung church bells and towers in Boston. And the epicenter was New Madrid, Missouri, not too far from here. But Robert Penn Warren, in his book, Brother to Dragons, focuses on that night of the New Madrid earthquake, also the night on which Thomas Jefferson's nephews brutally murdered a slave and escaped justice. I just find it's a complete coincidence that Robert Penn Warren borrowed one half of the Bible verse for his title, and I borrowed the other half of the same verse for my title. And he's dealing with Jefferson, and I'm dealing with Boone. Very interesting coincidence that, good Lord, I could never have anticipated. But it stays with me. Sorry, that was a digression. The meaning of time. On occasion, I would meet an Indian in possession of a broken pocket watch, one no doubt bartered from the British or plundered from a dead settler, who had no idea he held a device to measure minutes and hours, who had no notion of gears, and had a one-sided concept of springs. Simple objects of flow, mouths spilling out the watery secrets of the nether world. Would such an Indian study the frozen hands and face to see how long it takes to make a fire, gut a buffalo? Is sunlight dripping on the leaves a question suitable for clocks? Can a wounded man be spoken of in terms of neutral hours? Is the whole world endlessness? Yes, it is. The world is endless cause and need, slow motion and design. The world is irreversible, no matter how much you let it tick down. A white man boiling berries, tying and retying his purse strings. A red man staring at the sky. A silver case flashing moonlight. There is no measure or meaning in this low world. The present is always passing away. What matters is nature, with even-tempered mischief, always breaking her own rules like a child at play. A possible blessing. It's good to see the world as dying out, an ember in an ash pit, a locust husk still clinging to an elder bough, a stone turned up by a silvered plow, or a man who smears his face against his sleeve as if he wants to wipe away his name and leave a blank. The sense of last is like the sense of first, and one is almost the same as nothing. Yet, some joy is part of fading, part of being cold for one purpose which is rightly called unapologetic loss. You are the son of an insignificant world. A kiss blown off a cliff, true love without the chance to be denied, the unrequited life. Frozen to its shell is the locust's jagged smile. The stone chuckles back into the earth. The coal extinguishes itself and gloats. The man who understands diminishment will lay down in his coffin from time to time and practice disappearing like a bug riding a twig on a stream, a speck of unbelonging immersed in careless undulation. You lose your obligation to remember, which frees you to the quickened world of matter. Is grace forgetting we are but specks in the iris of a monstrous eye? It is true that, historically true, that Daniel Boone he built his own coffin in Missouri in his later life, and he would take naps in it. He was certain he was going to die any day about 5 or 6 years before he actually did die. And so he had this handy coffin lying around, and he'd just stretch out in it and take a nap. So in case he happened to die during his nap, he'd already be, in the coffin. Just little things like that made me convinced that he was an interesting man who, despite living with danger all around him for most of his life, he kept a sense of humor. At some point in the 1770s, his daughter, Daniel Boone, and his wife Rebecca had 11 children. And his daughter Jemima was one of his, thought to be his favorite child. And in the 1774, she was kidnapped by Shawnee Indians and taken across the Ohio River and held on their way to go across the Ohio River. They took her across the Kentucky River near Fort Boonesboro on their way to the Ohio, and Boone caught up with them a few days later, and she came back home okay. This is called, her name was Jemima, Jemima's Idol. A Cherokee named Hanging Maw, a Shawnee in the river with a knife, 3 girls in a canoe soaking their feet, then the Shawnee pulling the girls silently to the other bank. Jemima's black hair hung to her knees. That night, Hanging Maw's hands on Jemima's head, his rough English, his companions' gaping looks. Then her hands in his hair, looking for lice. An unbelievably gentle kidnap scene, full of artful delay and courtesy. 3 days later, her skirt torn off at the knees, I find her threadbare trail of broken sticks, muddied water. A spring, barefoot. I spring barefoot from the woods. 3 girls sprung from the red belly of an Indian whale. Jemima's funny nickname, Duck. Our ragged life of questions. My pronouncement that deliverance is shaped like the mouth of God. Jemima's keen agreement that the world is more than killing. Sleeping in the wilderness, something that Daniel Boone did much of his life without a GPS. No matter how well you dress the hide, a buffalo rug will always smell like buffalo. It is a rank odor and wild, charged with old glands and cud and the memory of running 10 winters, the last 2 blind. So you take your bed in this way, raking dry leaves into a grave-sized mound beneath you, pulling the mossy cloak upon you, and you spit out the last bitter cinders from your fire and submerge your head, feeling the dank fur on your face, and you try to breathe. What good are the dim stars on such nights? They only make heaven seem colder and farther away. So you rekindle the dream about Rebekah, in which the 2 of you are resting in the shade of a sycamore, and you skip a rock for her across the river. And as you prepare to skip another, she grabs your rough hand and puts it in her hair. Then she lays her generous bones next to yours. In the morning, you wrap the rug around you, check your powder, rub some ashes on your teeth, and go to the creek where you wash all traces of night from your face. You walk until walking warms you. Then you fold the rug and lash it to your horse, and you keep going to the next blue lick and the next, the taste of salt already on your tongue, a precious grain of civilization clinging to your brutal frame like a pocket watch or a lock of hair. But you are looking for an elk or a bear, sniffing the air for musk. In 1778 or so, Daniel Boone himself was kidnapped by Shawnee Indians and taken across the Ohio River into southern Ohio. And he spent the winter with them. He proved to be such a good shot with the rifle that he could feed the group of Indians who had captured him, and they let him keep a rifle. And at some point, the chief of this group of Indians, his name was Blackfish, and he adopted Daniel Boone as his son. And this is a poem that imagines the adoption ceremony. This is called Sheltawi, which is the Shawnee word, and that was the name Blackfish gave to Daniel Boone, Sheltawi. The women shaved my head with a mussel shell and took me to the river to wash away my whiteness. And then they smeared me head to toe with bear grease and tied 3 eagle feathers to the tuft of hair they'd left sprouting out of my head like the earliest shoots of corn. And then I stood in the sun all day until the grease dried on my skin and I was red like them. That night Blackfish declared I was his son and gave me a Shawnee son's name that meant big turtle, and took a stick and drew my shape in the sand. How a fish could father a turtle I didn't know. I believed, though, it was possible, for Blackfish had a skill with humble words, as if he only had to speak the word, and the air would make it so, obeying his command. Captivity is not the word that I would use when women place a string of beads around your neck and giggle to themselves. Or Blackfish says, you now have power over water, and when you call the birds who live above the sun, they'll hear you, and rain will fall upon the ground. Wanted to read this poem called A Compendium of Trees, because I had to check with some of my friends here, my spies in the audience. One of the trees mentioned in this poem is the sassafras tree, and I recall from Kentucky lore that Owensboro is home to what is claimed to be the oldest sassafras tree known. That's an important claim. A lot of places would just as soon cut them down. This is called A Compendium of Trees. My favorite, the sassafras, whose leaf looks like the hand of a three-fingered child, or perhaps a turkey foot, the shape of an ancient letter, but misinscribed as if it were a writ of imperfection, whose root chews sweet and soothes a woodsman's aching tooth. I fancy, too, the dogwood stricken by a vengeful god, whose blood-stained bloom is like an eagle's eye, unflinching on its prey. A tree that grows beneath the might of giants, an urchin in the shadow of a queen, a shepherd boy among the Philistines. I've felled both oaks and poplars with my axe and made a gun stock from the ash. I praise such famous trees for what they yield, but I praise more the haw, whose thorns are uninviting, the Osage orange for its deadly fruit, these humble chariots of wonderment. May I be swallowed by their stubborn mirth. So that's also his vision of the afterlife. If I just go into the ground and a tree absorbs me to be a bigger, better tree, that's good enough for heaven. Daniel Boone was also sort of a statesman in the way that John Kerry is a statesman today, traveling all over the place trying to get people to stop killing each other. In Boone's case, he was often trying to make peace with the Indians around. He had no real interest in fighting Indians at all. This is a moment of tension called Drunk, July 1787. Dust caught in the throat, a black cabin full of anxious Shawnees, and the hot, still night sucking away the bug song in the trees. Reason enough to seek the sobering brotherhood in a clay jug of old Monongahela. Men taking draws after other men, ragged sleeves drawn across chins, amber drops in the dust. I stab the ground with my knife and fold my arms. A nameless Indian tosses a corncob stopper into the fire, and the room blazes into wild light. Glassy faces and the smell of old blood. We are like one man alone, twisting his face into a dizzy grin. All is well in the leaning world. We smoke. I give a white man's cough and laugh. pissing in a stump. This is totally imagined. There's no record of Daniel Boone ever having urinated in a stump. But I like to think he probably did. If you walk around the woods enough, you start thinking. Your mind wanders just like your feet, just like your eyes, flitting from one thing to another, ground to sky, bug to leaf, sun to shade. It makes you happy. And for a moment, you stop to wonder why. But you get tired of the difference between a man and God. The very notion of peace wears you out. So you amuse yourself with trifles. You count a salamander's spots. You flap your arms and squawk. You say, "I see you," to a fox. The voice inside your head asks, why must every action have a meaning? Just once, you'd like to live a day that has no aim. You spy a stump, solemn as a minister. You peer into its hollow neck. You relieve yourself. You void your bladder and your day. Everything that matters is canceled out, pissed away. Daniel Boone he was born in Reading, Pennsylvania in 1734, died in Frontier, Missouri in 1820, having spent a big middle portion of his life settling Kentucky and then basically getting run out of Kentucky. Cheated and mistreated. It was before country music, but he probably could have written a really good country song. But he was raised Quaker, and some of you may know that Quakers are interested in peace. They don't believe in violence or war. They also did not believe in slavery at this time. And that's the world Boone was raised in. And this is a reflection on my imagination of his reflection on being raised Quaker. We were not the type to shake and tremble, though our garb was plain enough. We believed in being quiet, the wisdom of not speaking unless there was something that needed to be said, such as a gentle reproach, of which I got enough, since I didn't care for the plow or the loom. My father was a weaver, its work well suited to the quiet type, even if you have 11 children. And my mother, God rest her soul, was fond of these and thous, and early on I knew I loved the sweetness of her old world tongue. But despite their reputation, Quakers are high-strung people. And my older sister and brother married worldlings, pursuing their fallible will. And in the end, the Society of Friends kicked us out. The timing was, however, lucky, as my father was keen to move farther into God's green creation. And after all, aren't we all worldlings in a way? Of course, I've had my scuffs. I've borne my share of sins. But to be honest, I never saw the need to make my peace with God, since I never felt we disagreed. Two more? Is that good? Okay. Another character from Kentucky history that you all may know about is John James Audubon. Yeah. There is a famous story that Audubon himself recorded in a book that he wrote in the mid-1800s, after Boone's death. Audubon wrote a book called Delineations of the American Character. And it was sort of his kind of tales of meeting people in the woods as he traveled all over the South, especially in Kentucky in particular, painting birds. Yeah? Right through this area, for sure. There was one occasion in the 18 teens, maybe 1818 or so, when Boone had traveled back to Kentucky and was going to pay some debts that were wrongly ascribed to him, but he was a man of conscience, and he said, okay, if someone holds these debts against me, I'm going to go settle them. So he had come back from Missouri, at this point a very old man, and he runs into John James Audubon in the woods, and they spend the night beside a campfire together. So and Audubon had big flowing red hair. He was and wore velvet in the woods. Go figure. And so in this poem I compare him to a pileated woodpecker, which is the biggest woodpecker with a bright red crest. And so this poem is given the Latin name for the bird, Driocarpus pileatus. He introduced himself as an American woodsman and a scientist, a thinking man who drew from nature the bounty of the Creator, and he was serious. I took careful note of his fanciful plumage, his long red hair, his green sash, his ruffled velvet leggings. Odd wear for a woodsman, I decided, but perhaps the sphere of science is more colorful than I had thought. He had a retriever and a pea gun and a bundle full of dead birds and a book of pictures in his own hand. He'd made a catalog of rivers and was keen on shooting sports, so I barked a mess of squirrels for him, and we supped as old friends would, swapping tales, passing the jug, making what merriment we could. Before sleep could claim us, he brushed his hair the way a woman would. Nodding to the fire, I said, "The bounty of which you boast, I fear it will not last." He lifted a dead bird into the air, stroked its red crown, and gave a laugh that I scarce could call a laugh. I believe the way they met, Audubon and Boone met, was Boone was walking through the woods singing, all alone, singing at the top of his voice. An interesting parallel that I didn't know at the time that I wrote the poem I just read, but Audubon brought his fiddle into the wilderness with him, and he would play the fiddle around the campfire after he'd spent all day tracking down birds and sketching them. It's wonderful. Boone's had 10 other siblings, and he was very close to his oldest brother. Squire was his name. This reflects on him and sort of Boone's final days. This is the last poem I'll read, and afterwards I'll be happy to take some questions. Testament. Squire's boys laid him in a cave for several days, granting him one final whim, that if his spirit were unfettered by the earth, it might be free to visit them and tell them all the wonders of the other side. It was a tenderly foolish plan, but death promotes such schemes. Still, one will make provisions, and I have cast my lot in that regard. One day in Osage country I was hunting with Derry, my sole companion now for 15 years, and death dealt me a fever which I thought would be the end. So Derry bore me on his shoulders and took me to a bluff above the river, and I said, "Plant me here when I am gone." But I love the God-made world so much that I recovered to hunt again. Yet I know my days are winding down. I will go and not return. My estate is a simple matter to resolve. I leave my rifle to whoever wants it. Don't dress me up for death. Leave me naked and fill my box with mast. I'm taking seeds to heaven in case God needs more trees. When I swim the pitch-hued river, bury me beside Rebekah. And when his days run out of numbers, bury Derry next to me. Thank you.